Hello, everybody, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. I am Ranjay Gulati from the Harvard Business School, and it's my pleasure today, as part of this series of conversation with CEOs, to welcome David Vélez. He's the founder and CEO of Nubank, which has really done an extraordinary job of becoming probably the most preeminent digital bank in the world, coming out of nowhere in less than 10 years. Gives all of us hope that you can get a lot done in a very short span of time if you just put your head to it. So, David, welcome, and I'm delighted to be talking to you today.
Hi, Professor Gulati. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, David, I'm going to dive right in. There's so much to talk to you about. I want to start from the very beginning, early days. You were 12 years old, you bought 2 head of cattle, and you seem to have an entrepreneurial spirit in you from the very get go. And then somehow you land from there, and your journey involves moving to somehow coming to Stanford. And then on your way to banking and finance, kind of just tell us a quick snapshot of your journey and how that shaped who you are. Are there any moments along the way that really were impactful for you?
I'm originally from Colombia. Come from a family of entrepreneurs, both from my dad's side and my mom's side. We had to leave Colombia when I was 8 years old. This was the late 80s when Colombia was a really dangerous place to grow. My parents took me and my sisters and we moved to Costa Rica. My dad had a button factory and he moved it to Costa Rica. It was a small factory, had about 12 employees. But I grew up in the environment, working with him in the summers, going in and making buttons, and ultimately hearing from him, from my uncle, from my mom, that the path to follow was owning your own destiny, being your own boss, and that entrepreneurship was the way to go. So I kind of grew up in that environment, hearing that consistently. You tell a story when I was 12, I had saved some money after working a couple of summers with my dad, and I decided that the best investment and the best startup I could do was buying a pair of cows because the cows multiply themselves. And so my dad had 6 cows. I convinced him to let me buy one. I bought one. And then from 12 to 18, that cow became another 6 cows. And that was kind of the entryway or understanding of compound interest, I say, of seeing the potential of exponentiating at one's investment. So obviously, my dad was nice enough that he didn't make me pay any expenses, no veterinary, no food. So ultimately, this became actually a really good business. And I sold them when I was 18 when I went to school. I went to Stanford. I was always very fascinated, given entrepreneurship, with the story of Silicon Valley and the people that have built great companies that were building it around the area. So decided to go there. I was determined to find a business idea in my first couple of years at Stanford. The years passed by, and I had no idea how to even begin. I did not have that great insight. I did not have that great uh, startup idea. So, to my own disappointment at the time, I decided to go to Wall Street and take an investment banking job during my junior summer internship. And it turns out that I actually enjoyed it very much, and I liked the culture. I was testing myself a lot. I was learning a lot. So by the time I graduated from undergrad, I went full time to do banking. Was did that for about 2 years, then went to private equity, slowly moving closer and closer and closer to the business. At private equity, working for a firm named General Atlantic, I really enjoyed the opportunity there because they were about to open something in Latin America for the first time. And in Brazil. I was not Brazilian, but I think I was the closest thing they had to a Brazilian. So they asked me, would you want to go to Brazil and open our office there? And I immediately jumped to the opportunity that seemed like a great startup opportunity. So I moved to Brazil, was with them for a few years, still always thinking what to start. Nothing. I did not have the idea. I had a little list of a couple of ideas, but I was not ready. I didn't feel ready. And so, to my perhaps own disappointment, once again, went back to business school with the idea of using those 2 years to figure out what to do. And then I ended up working for another financial services firm for Sequoia. Sequoia shows up, tells me, David, you've done this in Brazil with General Atlantic. Why don't you come join us and to start Sequoia in Brazil? Again, that sounded like an interesting opportunity. I did it with them. But then, after about 6 months, worked 2 years working with them, 6 months after grad post MBA, we all came to the sad realization that there was not much tech or startup opportunities in Brazil, and it didn't make any sense for Sequoia to open an office locally. So they asked me to go back to California and keep working with them. To me, that was enough. I had to do this. I had to finally become an entrepreneur. So I told my boss, Doug, I'm out. Thank you, but I really, really, really want to start something. And I had spent a lot of time in financial services, so I spent a few months trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And then after a lot of conversations, a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, decided that the idea of Nubank was what I wanted to really pursue.
Here's a question for you. Most of us talk about entrepreneurs who take the leap. They don't sit around waiting. Yours was a story of caution, or was it hesitation? Something held you back, right? That you weren't quite ready to take the plunge. And it was only when Sequoia said to you, okay, we're out of here, come to California or you're done, that you decided. What do you think was holding you back necessarily? Was it that you hadn't found the right opportunity, or you yourself didn't feel quite ready to take there's too many temptations out there, great jobs in investment banking, they pay really well. What do you think was the hesitation?
I think it was a combination of not having the clear idea and the conviction, and also not feeling prepared. In there, right after undergrad, what did I know about starting a business? I hadn't even worked for a big business before, and through the different experiences, while there weren't that many, I was able to look at different type of businesses, compare them. Especially in private equity, I worked very closely with a number of different portfolio companies. I remember sitting in front of a number of CEOs, listening to them telling the story about their business, and on one end, like being very jealous, and wanting to be on their side of the business, but not feeling prepared yet, not knowing enough to be able to do something like what they were doing. So I think ultimately it was kind of a combination of finding the right conviction, which after spending 4 years in financial services in Latin America, I became very excited about the opportunity that there was behind financial services, and combined with already knowing enough, not knowing too much and not knowing too little, but knowing enough to at least have a shot at focusing for the next 10, 20, 30 years in trying to build something that could be potentially be significant.
In this journey, who were the people who really influenced you? Was there some people? I know your father, obviously, as an entrepreneur, the family. Were there others who came along the way you saw and you said, that's somebody I really want to be like?
Both in General Atlantic and in Sequoia, every single meeting when I was in front of an entrepreneur, I was super inspired, and I was fascinated by the problems that they have to tackle, by the way they thought about their culture, by all the different complexities and opportunities that were around their businesses. These were a number of different portfolio companies that we invested in, some of them in healthcare and financial services. I had the opportunity to work very closely with Nigel Morris, who's the co-founder of Capital One, when I was at GA, and I was fascinated by Nigel. We got to look at a number of different banks, traditional banks in Mexico and in Colombia and in Brazil. And I heard him asking questions to the CEO, and these were questions that were interesting, were questions that I didn't even know enough to know that they were important to be asking. And so I was really curious about his experience. And then at Sequoia, I think Sequoia for me was a big, my mind was blown for a number of different reasons when I joined. I had spent 5 years in more Wall Street type of firms, more New York, let's call them, that tend to be much more bureaucratic and perhaps a little bit more hierarchical. When I moved to Silicon Valley, and it was with Sequoia, it was a very different structure, different culture. Sequoia was a very small team where the first interview that I had was with the CEO of Sequoia, with Doug Leone. That was very odd. Generally, in all the firms that I used to go, you start with the most junior person and then you go up. Here, since the first impression was I was meeting with the head and then I was going down. Then when I started working there, I saw a very flat organization where the most young person was called a partner, was treated as a partner, and was accountable to have a point of view about all the deals and about everything that was going on. And so I felt a level of motivation and empowerment that I had never felt in my entire life. And that's when I started really understanding the importance of company culture and how culture becomes this underlying horizontal magic that empowers the performance of organization. So I think that entire company culture and Doug specifically as a boss, as a head, was very, very inspirational to me. And I took a lot of those lessons as I went to start Nubank.
So let's talk about Nubank. You're not Brazilian. How do you? Okay, you're living in Brazil. You have an idea that banks are pretty bureaucratic and hard to, or as you said, it was like felt like going to jail when you were trying to open a bank account in Brazil. So how do you decide that this is the opportunity? You lived in California for 4 years. You didn't see anything there. You lived in New York. You didn't see anything there. How did it come together? And you said, "I'm going to do this."
I had spent 2 years in Brazil with General Atlantic, and I had looked at a lot of financial services. And to me, it was a really interesting market because it is the largest market. There's nothing bigger in Latam. When you look at who are the biggest companies in Brazil, they're banks. The biggest company in Mexico, they're banks. In Colombia, they're banks. So, from a sheer size perspective, with these very, very large organizations, these were organizations that, through good times and bad times, generated an incredible amount of money. They were some of the most profitable financial institutions in the world. And in 2012, when I went back to Brazil, I had one experience that I always think that it was a bit of the catalyst to help me go and identify the opportunity. I had to go open a bank account in Faria Lima. This Faria Lima is sort of the downtown. It's almost like the equivalent of the Wall Street of Latin America, in one of the very nice branch of one of the largest banks. And I had to go through that experience that often tell about, that it looked more like a prison than a nice place where you're welcome as a customer. I had to go through a bulletproof door that had two armed guards. Since I had my cell phone in my pocket, the alarm started sounding because I had metal. The guards came out of the branch. They grabbed me. They asked me to put all my stuff in a locker outside the branch, to then come back in, then waiting 45 minutes to talk to somebody that had no interest really in helping me. And he clearly let me know with his attitude. And then that was the beginning of a 4-month process of going back again and again and again, and finally getting a simple bank account that charged me hundreds of dollars a year and charged one of the highest interest rates in the world. I was enraged by that experience. I was very frustrated with the probably 30 hours of time that I did not have, that I had to invest in that experience. And so when I combined that insight of how bad the user experience was with the original insight that this is the largest bank, these are the most profitable industry in Latin America, that seemed to me like a really interesting opportunity, because I couldn't understand, how are people putting up with this? And if their margins are so big, why isn't anybody competing with those big banks? Why isn't anybody trying to challenge these very established incumbents?
But David, a first-time entrepreneur, I would imagine, would start small with a small idea. Maybe buy a few more cows, or or maybe build a button factory. Buttons really well in Brazil, but you're saying, "I want to build a bank." That sounds really hard. I mean, that's like taking on the behemoths of banking. These are big companies with large pockets, and they can snuff you out in a second.
I think that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to do that, and I'll tell you why. During that time, there was the earliest beginnings of tech entrepreneurship in Brazil, and I remember seeing a model of the Groupon of Brazil. It was a very popular model that everybody was starting. At some point, there were 3,000 clones of Groupon in Brazil, and this happened over a 6-month period. There were a lot of clones of Amazon in Brazil, a lot of e-commerce clones, a lot of undifferentiated businesses that in 6 months you had a ton of competition. And as I thought about what I wanted to do, and I thought about it doing it from like an investor perspective, I had never been an operator, but I had worked as an investor. And entrepreneurship is effectively the biggest investment you're going to do, right? You're not only investing your money, you're investing your time, and you're all in. You're putting all the eggs in one basket. So to me, that meant that I had to find something that was very hard to do so that I would have less competition, that had significant impact, because I was ready to dedicate the next decade or plus of my life on something. It might as well be something impactful that made a difference versus something easy that everybody could copy. And by this point, I think I had kind of getting to a bit of an understanding of what really motivated me, and had come to a conclusion that I was very much motivated by the size of the challenge and by the level of impact. And to me, while everybody told me this is impossible, I thought this was the single most impactful thing I could imagine. I would ask me the question, what is more impactful? What is hardest to do in Latin America than starting a bank from scratch? And there was nothing. There was no answer to that question. It was the hardest thing that I could possibly imagine. And so to me, that was very motivating. And when I started talking to a lot of the local experts in the industry, I had a lot of conventional wisdom. People saying, David, you're not Brazilian. You have no idea what you're doing. The big banks are going to crush you. It cannot work. One of the big banks, Unibanco, tried a digital bank in 1999 and they failed, and that's why you're going to fail. And so there were a lot of these arguments that when I listened carefully to them, but when I would go and double click to them, I would realize there was just a lot of they had a lot of lack of solidity, and there was just a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear in the environment about competing with these big banks, and that's why nobody had even tried it to do. And ultimately, that bad experience that I had gone through, that everybody in Brazil could relate to, was real, was there, and people just were ready. Basically, what I had to bet is that we were able to execute, and that people were going to be treated better and pay less fees.
So, but David, how do you find the confidence? I mean, who was there anybody who believed in you? You did have some investors you were able to convince to invest in you. Were there others who were? What was your support system to kind of convince yourself that you could actually do this?
It was a tough because I heard a lot of no's, especially from the experts. A lot of the local experts, the former CEO of a Brazilian bank, the expert in banking, all of them were basically saying no, impossible, and they had their own arguments. But I would really listen carefully to those arguments. I was just not bought in because I was developing a lot of conviction of how digital and technology could fundamentally alter this industry and provide better products at lower cost. But then I was very lucky to go back to Sequoia, to my former boss, and present it to him. And his first reaction is like, well, this seems interesting, but we don't do seed investments in Brazil. We don't know anything about banks. And maybe I'll invest because I like you, but this is not a Sequoia investment. But then I spent a week talking to a number of different partners at Sequoia. And after that week, I had to present the entire partnership, and they came back and said, we're in. We want to invest, we want to invest $1 million. And we think you should try to find a local investor for another $1 million. And I went and looked for Kazakh Ventures. Kazakh was the former startups founders of Mercado Libre. I knew them very well from General Atlantic, presenting to them. They also liked it. And with that, that was enough. So while I got 30 no's, I got 2 yeses that mattered a lot, that gave a lot of support. And also, I have been able to develop a lot of conviction about this, and ultimately felt that I had to give it a shot. And ultimately also wasn't really too hung up on failing. Like for me, the journey, the adventure was good enough. Even if I failed, I felt that it was better to be failing doing something big than failing doing something small. And so at the end of the day, there was just no fear. It was just more excitement about the adventure that I was going to get myself into.
Okay, so let's get into the bank itself now. New bank. I mean, how do you build a bank that A, you don't have a banking license, first of all, right? You start a credit card business, so you're going to go into credit cards, you're going to lower interest rates. How do you make money in a business where you say, I'm going to have low fees or no fees? How do you build a profitable business in a model where you're saying, I'm going to charge much less than anybody else? Now, your cost structure is lower as a digital bank. You don't have any of the overhead, but still, you got to find somewhere to make money. You can't tell customers everything is free.
The end goal was always to be a full digital bank. So a full bank, multi-product without branches. And the basic insight was these branches and this infrastructure and this huge hierarchy of the big banks is just too expensive. Today, just to give you one data point, today we have 54 million customers that we serve with about 6,000 employees. Our competitors in Brazil have also around 50 million customers, and they have over 100,000 employees. So we can serve the same amount of customers today than they do with 20x more efficiency per employee. And that's just the employee side. I'm not talking about all those big branches, 6,000 branches. I remember walking that Faria Lima street that I was mentioning about and seeing and counting. I walked from one side of the Faria Lima to the other side. I counted 94 branches of 5 banks. There were corners that have 4 branches of the same bank. It was insane. It's like, how can a competitive industry, what kind of margins do you have to be able to afford that kind of inefficiency where you have 4 big branches in the same corner? So there was clearly very large margins, and there was clearly a lot of inefficiency. And so the bet, as I said, was being a full digital bank, fully focused on the consumer with no branches and much more efficiency. But as you said, we didn't have a banking license initially. So we had to figure out a strategy to begin in one product and then become multi-product, eventually getting a banking license. So we started with credit card as a first product. That credit card was a great product to build a consumer brand, to start developing a muscle around credit. Credit as a skill set is probably the single most important skill set in financial services in Latin America. It represents 70% of all the profits of the system. So since day one, we had a product that had real profitability, that had a real business model. And we used that credit card as an entry path to then offering a number of other financial services products, ultimately getting a banking license, and ultimately offering a bunch of different products. So how do we make money? We make money basically 3 ways. We make money through interchange. Every time a customer uses the credit card, we get something around 1.5% of every transaction from the merchants. Then when customers finance themselves with the credit card, we charge an interest rate. And then we have fees. We charge fees of the products that we cross-sell. So we cross-sell investment products, insurance products, and a number of other products that we ultimately end up cross-selling to all our users.
So, David, there's no rocket science here. I mean, anybody could do it, right? I mean, this is not like some sophisticated algorithm that nobody can copy you, right? Interchange fees, cross-selling products, offering digital services. Why did nobody come chasing you?
I think the basic insight is clear, but frankly, it's the same basic insight that any technology company or digital company had, right? You would think about Amazon the same way. It's so easy to launch books online. Why isn't anybody copying? Or Netflix. It's easy to have a bunch of content that you deliver online. Similarly, here is easy to be a fully digital financial services platform and deliver those products digitally. What is hard about that? It's hard, number one, to build a culture that is consumer obsessed, because ultimately that's what drives product development, and that's what drives a user acquisition that is effectively zero. All our growth has been viral. We spent effectively no money on marketing. And that's because we decided to, instead of investing a ton of money on TV or Google or Facebook, we decided to invest in customer service so that consumers had such a great experience that then they ultimately would grow very, very fast through word of mouth. The other parts that I think was ultimately hard is in financial services, at least credit underwriting is fundamentally hard. That's where a lot of the AI and machine learning comes into play. Credit is a bit like playing with fire. You can do great things with fire, but you can also get burned really badly. And that's why most fintechs globally, or even most neobanks, started with payments first, and then they went to credit. We are very unique in that we decided to start with credit first, and then we went to payments. And that meant that we had to be very, very good at credit underwriting. That forced us to go get some of the best credit talent in the world, which we brought from Capital One, built very sophisticated data infrastructure on the cloud that can process over 9,000 different variables to be able to give the right limit to the right person at the right time, be able to really underwrite risk at the n equals 1, and not what the banks do, which is effectively everybody gets the same line, everybody gets the same interest rate. So that the entire managing credit at a very large pace and very high growth through a lot of data, that is probably the most sophisticated, technically complex part of what we do today.
So, David, one thing I'm curious is that, you got an idea, you're going to execute it, you're going to build a digital bank. You've never really run an organization before. You got a banking and finance background, and we teach this, right, in business schools about scaling an enterprise. How do you build it? How do you create talent? How do you think about customer obsession? Where did you go about figuring all that out? Or did you bring in a COO or somebody else? I know you had a partner. Did you have somebody else who was helping you grow the organization and kind of figure out how you're going to scale and put system structures in place without becoming bureaucratic?
Definitely one insight or one principle that we had at the beginning was that it was going to be really important to build a team that had a lot of diversity of knowledge and experience. I remember one conversation that I had with one of the partners at Sequoia who told me very candidly that it seems like a great opportunity, but you don't have the background to build this. And it was a bit of a punch, a low blow, but I really thank him for that type of candid feedback, because that forced me to say that he's totally right. I got to find people that to bring on board that have the level of experience and skill set that I don't have. And my two co-founders, I looked for them specifically to do that. There were two key gaps that I had in that initial team. One was engineering. I wanted to build a technology company, not a bank. And so building the right technology infrastructure, recruiting the right engineers was a key core skill set. So I found Ed, my co-founder, who was a computer scientist. He helped build that entire technology. The other key gap that I had initially was I'm not Brazilian. I don't have a network in Brazil. I don't know regulators. I didn't even speak great Portuguese. So I wanted to look, I was a perfect outsider to the system. And being outsider has a lot of advantages. I don't think this opportunity could have been identified by an insider, because insiders are so consumed in conventional wisdom that it is often very hard for them to reimagine the world as it is. So outsiders tend to be able to look at these old problems with new eyes. And that's what I was able to bring as I developed the thesis. But ultimately, to execute, you needed a lot of insider knowledge. And so I went and looked for a lot of people with that insider knowledge. I found Chris, my other co-founder. She came from one of the biggest banks. She had run a credit card portfolio there. So she brought a lot of that credit expertise. And with that, we started scaling the team. And at every single step, there were a lot of skill sets that we didn't have. Even the three of us together, there were 10 things we didn't know. And so it's been a process for the past 8 years of consistently identifying where the gaps are, and then going around the world trying to identify who are the best people in the world that do something and bringing them on board. And that has happened consistently. And at times, somebody is right for any given point in time, but 6 months after, the company has doubled or tripled in size, and we have to go back and reopen the search again because that person didn't have that experience at scale. So it's a lot of building the team, and it's a process that never really ends. But if you begin with the assumption that you don't know what you don't know, with a lot of humility and understanding that nobody will know everything, nobody has all the answers, but together we can have some answers, then it creates a culture that is very open to integrate external DNA and knowledge to be consistently transforming to fill any gaps that we might have.
So, David, one thing you've described your organization as saying we're not a bank, we're a technology company, right? You've talked about customer obsession. What do you think are the hallmarks? And a lot of companies today are talking about becoming a digital organization or becoming a tech company. Even Amazon says that we're not a retailer, we happen to be a tech company that happens to be doing retail. What are the hallmarks of this customer? And by the way, they also talk about customer obsession. What are the hallmarks of a customer obsessed, technology driven company that may be going after a particular market?
Customer obsession is, as you say, a lot of people are talking about it today, but it's similar to any other cultural value that companies have. Uh, the real values are the way you behave, not the way you talk. It's actions speak louder than words. And for us, this was a value that we, in the early days, when we had about three people, we set up a culture deck. We sat down together one afternoon, put together a culture presentation that had effectively the five values of Nubank. And one was that consumer obsession. We want customer to love us fanatically. And we almost, did a pact of blood that was going to be driving every single decision in the company, because we deeply believe that while in the short term, sometimes there might be conflicts between prioritizing the customer and prioritizing profitability or short term results, in the long run, those two things are perfectly aligned. Because ultimately, in a world of options, consumers can choose, and consumers will ultimately choose whoever is treating them better and offering better products. So that was the logic of picking that value as number one. And then it was all about building an organization that went back to those principles every single day and in every single decision. I'll give you one example that to me, we have many of these, but I'll give you one specific example I think talks a lot. About a year ago, one day, an analyst comes and says, we're making more money per customer. We're seeing revenue go up on a cohort basis. And people start asking, like, what happened? And we went and looked. And it turns out that there had been a bug in the system, and somebody had removed an email that reminded the customer to pay on time. And because they removed that, people were paying more late fees. It was really easy for everybody in the organization to know what to do, which was put that email back and go back to the customers that we overcharged, apologize to them, tell them that they shouldn't have paid that it was our mistake, and give the money back. It was the easiest conversation. And it was the easiest conversation because there was a cultural value that gave everybody in the organization the permission to act that way. I can bet you whatever you want that a lot of companies, especially banks today, would have the same situation. They would not act that way. Even the ones that say culture and obsession, they would have not acted that way because it's easy to say it. It's hard when you're faced with those actual dilemmas of making more money or prioritizing the customer. But if you think about it, that those customers received that email and said, wow, how different is Nubank? They're telling me, if they didn't need to tell me this, I wouldn't even have realized it. It was my fault for being late. But they're telling me proactively that I overpaid and they're giving me the money back. The value of that interaction is worth more than points, that fees, that a lot of TV advertising in the Super Bowl is worth more for any customer than anything else. So that is why I think beyond the value and having the clarity of the value at the beginning, probably the most important part is scaling the organization, being very vigilant that we are acting the way we're supposed to be acting.
So that's a great example. Thank you for that, David. I want to ask you another word. So I had a chance to interview Satya Nadella from Microsoft, and he also talked about culture as a key pillar for organizational success and transformation. He also talked about purpose. And since I've written a book now on deep purpose organizations, so I'm biased, I want to ask you, did you at any point start to ask the question that we at Nubank need to have a purpose, our mission about why we choose to be, and how that might also play into these kinds of dilemmas that you have to face?
That was part of that initial conversation that I mentioned about culture. One of the things that I had taken from Sequoia that to me was very valuable was the insight that the culture of a business is built by the first 10 to 15 employees in the first 6 months of life. Those first 6 months, those first 10 employees are really critical in building the key basis of that culture. And it's a bit like for whoever has kids, the early years of development, right? In those the first 5, 10 years when you're dealing with your kids, when you're teaching those values. I sometimes I hear from some CEOs that I'm very busy about building my culture. When we become a unicorn, then I'll care about that. And it's a little bit like saying I'm too busy to educate my kids. By the time they turn 18, I'll start working educating. Forget it. It's too late. So we spent a lot of time in those early days with those first 10, selecting those 10 employees and codifying the cultural values that I mentioned, including that consumer obsession. And one part of that culture deck was purpose. We had all of us, the three of us, the co-founders, we had already had enough experience. We were in the early 30s and we were ready to go and think about the next 2 decades of our life. And for all of us, it was clear that we wanted to do something that had a purpose, that had impact. Because I think increasingly we all had worked in businesses that were, we all had worked for jobs where you would go from 9 to 5, you get a good paycheck. And that was interesting, but we all felt that we needed something more. And when we sat down and discussed what we wanted to do, we agreed that nobody was going to be really that motivated to go and build a better credit card. Even not that motivated to go and build a better bank. There were other banks. Ultimately, we had to go choose something that had a bigger impact. And after a lot of discussion, we came up with a core purpose that has lasted until today, hasn't really changed in about 9 years, which is to fight complexity to empower people. And the reason we got to that was, first, we are about empowering people. We were very mad, we're upset about these big companies, not only banks, big companies that ultimately take their customers as hostage and use a lot of complexity, a lot of fees to keep even more hostages. And you end up with consumers that don't have the information to make the right decision for their lives. So we discussed a lot. We decided that ultimately the enemy was going to be complexity in financial services and beyond. And if we fought that complexity, we're going to be able to empower people and create 100, 200, 500 million Latin American consumers that were more empowered in their daily lives to be making better decisions and to ultimately be living a better life. And so that has been the North Star since those early days. And I think it served us very well, because when we interviewed the next candidate, when we go from 15 to 100 or to 1,000 or to 5,000, people come and talk to us like, why do I need to go to Nubank? It's like, no, you're not coming here to sell credit cards. You're coming here to empower 500 million consumers, to really change society, to bring more competition to these industries. And that's what really brings people passion for what they do. And I think there's a very, very unique opportunity to really work in a business that has passion and that redefines what you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
So, David, what do you have to say to the cynics? There's a lot of people who are cynical about purpose because they've seen enough companies pretend to have a purpose. It's usually some nice statement about, I want to make the world a better place, I want to improve the life of my customer, I want to help the planet, and they kind of cloak themselves in that purpose. What do you say to people like that? Saying, David, I don't believe this. I've heard that before. Come on, every bank has a purpose, and they always say something about helping customers.
It is true that a lot of organizations that claim to have a purpose and they don't have it. It's similarly to the conversation around customer obsession. Now everybody has customer obsessions, but then they face those moments when the email is out and they're charging consumers where they just go and act against those behaviors. So ultimately, I wouldn't throw the baby, with the wash water. There are organizations that do have real purposes, and I think for us, at least, what I can tell you about us, about Nubank, is in that deck since the very early days, and it really drives everything that drives our company. And you can go talk to any of our employees, any of the 6,000 people around the world, and you ask them, what do you do? And they will repeat this purpose, and they will go and execute products and consumer conversations, and they will treat customers in ways that are consistent with this purpose and with those values.
Do you think people come to work for you because of your purpose? Do you think they say, I want to come work for Nubank, not only because it's a digital company and doing all these great things, but I really connect personally. It makes my life, I feel more proud of working here. It makes me feel like I'm living my own life purpose because I get to be in a place which is doing these big things.
I think so. I really do. I think the time to go for a 9 to 6 job, especially for the young demographics, is over. People do not want to just go do that and get a paycheck. I think people need to feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves and work with great people, smart people that are all feel part of a mission that goes beyond just getting a paycheck. And that is consistent actually with building a great business. That's the thing. I think a lot of people also tend to address or to think about this question as being almost like a zero-sum game, where if I have a purpose, I'm going to make less money. And in fact, it's actually, if you have a purpose, you're going to make more money in the long run. In the short run, there will be conflicts. As I said, there is definitely conflicts, or at least our insight or belief is in the long run, those two are perfectly aligned. And that's why it's a great opportunity, and a great opportunity for retention, and a great opportunity to create and scale a culture that has a bigger reason to exist than simply go from $1 billion in net income this year to 1.5 billion in net income next year to 2 billion of net income the following year, which in a way is the way a lot of the banks have operated for a very long time.
How do you help people think about short term and long term? Because you're right, there's this inherent trade off, and people sometimes presume that a lot of people like Larry Fink and others have promoted you should have a purpose, but that's long term, but I got to deliver quarterly short term results. And now that I'm a public company, the pressures are even greater because now I have to really deliver numbers. Do you think having a purpose is a way to communicate also clearly that, look, we are making these choices because they have long-term benefit, it's part of who we are? Or how do you connect short and long term in your mind? as a business leader?
I think it begins with that insight that I mentioned, which is it's call it a hypothesis, a belief, which is you will win. Whoever wins in an industry is whoever provides the best product and service for consumers. Whoever is chosen by consumers. Consumers have the choice. Very simple insight. In reality, that really means that you have to work every single day to build the absolutely very best product. It's a bit what Jeff Bezos say. I don't know how things where consumers will look like 10 years from now, but I'll know they will want better products at lower cost. And ultimately, if a consumer is empowered and have choices, they will pick whoever treats them best, gives them a lower price, and gives them a better product. So that is ultimately the rationale, the logic for having a consumer obsessed company, because that company is going to go and create the very best product in the market and will allow it to win. Now, in the short term, you'll have real debates and real dilemma. I'd give you one example of a debate where if we had removed that email, or if we could have also even go and said, wow, let's go make more money. Let's remove two more emails and we'll make even more money in the short term. But by explaining to people why in the long run that's not the right answer, people will start understanding how these dynamics exist. But I'll give you the opposite example when something different happened. We started with a credit card that had a very, very low interest rate, artificially low. And after 3, 4 years, we started to realize that there were a significant percentage of customers that we could not approve because the interest rate was too low, the risk was too high. And that the best thing that we could do to be able to increase the business was to increase the interest rate. And so you could say, and we had a lot of debate with our employees, like, isn't this inconsistent with a consumer obsession? Why are you increasing interest rates if you're prioritizing our consumer obsession? It's like we're prioritizing consumer obsession in the long run. If we keep interest rate low, we'll reach perhaps 500,000 consumers, maybe 1 million. If we're able to increase this interest rate by this level, we can go to 50 million consumers. So the impact or the long run is much larger. And that's why in the short term, we might actually need to sacrifice a bit consumer expression so that we can in the long run have more impact and a big opportunity. So a lot of these trade-offs are complex. And the way to do it, I think, is just have a constant conversation with the company, with everybody, trying to look at some of these debates, some of these trade-offs from every different angle and get comfort that we really are optimizing for the long run. And as you say, I think being a public company does create a bit of a pressure of the short term, but at least from us, since we decided to go start preparing for an IPO over a year and a half ago, we were very, very clear with the company that this was just going to be a marketing event where we would raise some capital, and that's it. That for us, the IPO is just the beginning of the race, not the end. And so given that, nothing has changed. We continue to be as focused on the long run as possible, and there'll be short-term volatility and there'll be some short-term pressures, but the mandate for the company is continue thinking about the long run. There'll be some investors that won't like that, and they will self-select by selling our stock. There will some investors that will like that, and they will self-select by buying our stock.
So, David, one thing that comes to my mind is that as you described even earlier when you began the business about, doing hard things, having a big impact, all this requires courage, right? And of course, you found the courage in yourself to do it. How did you help your team find the courage, Is it just following you? Because some of these decisions are gutsy moves, right? Even focusing on long term over short term. And courage is, to me, taking action in the face of fear. Like, it's not like we have no fear. We're scared. Tell me a little bit about courage and how you and your team have talked about that, this is going to be risky. It's kind of scary. We don't know what's going to come of it, but we got to do it. How do you create that sense of courage in your organization?
Part is going back to initial conditions, those first 10, 15 employees, those first culture. And we even have a value. I talk about consumer obsession. We have a second value about we're hungry and challenge the status quo. That's our number 2 value. And I'll tell you one more story. We started the company in a small house. And small house, you would pass by, you wouldn't even imagine that somebody was working there. My co-founder lived in the second floor, had a dog. We spent a lot of time there. And we would invite people to interview. And there were 2 types of people that showed up. The first group would come in with their very nice suit and tie, ready to interview for a Sequoia-backed startup that wanted to uh, compete with big banks. And then they would go and see this house and they would think, what a waste of my time. These kids are crazy. There's no way these kids in this house can compete with the biggest bank in Latin America. And they wouldn't even show up. And then there was a second group of people that they would go in, ring the bell, come back in, sit with us for 30 minutes. We were telling them, yeah, we're about to go and disrupt the biggest industry in Latin America. Yes, we're going to go compete with the biggest companies. And no, we don't really have fear. We're ready to go it. And you know what? If we fail, again, it's better to fail doing big things than small things. So what a great adventure, right? We're ready for the adventure. And people would say, I'm in. I'll be starting on Monday. So that house was the perfect filter. It created the perfect self-selection in that it biased the people that were courageous enough to go after these giants and go fight this fight. And so that DNA, that correct, let's call it the courageous gene, was part of those first 10, 15 employees, part of the culture. We then went and hired 100, 1,000, 5,000. And that has been a consistent value across the entire organization where we go and challenge the status quo. Now, people, of course, we run into trouble and we've had tough times. And we had a specifically very hard time a couple of years ago when one day we wake up and regulation had completely changed and there were real questions about whether we were going to subside. At that moment, one of the things that we do to address courage is first see every one of these challenges as an opportunity to test ourselves and really test what we built. So instead of us becoming frozen by the fear, we feel motivated because we want to challenge ourselves, we want to test ourselves. And the second was an opportunity to really reinforce that culture, putting everybody in the boat and go from this peacetime mentality to wartime mentality where we need to go together to figure out what we're going to do with this problem. And so it's also how you behave in the face of adversity and showing people that there are different ways to behave, not being a hostage, but being empowered, that you start building these, really rebuilding this value of courage across the organization.
Tell me a little bit about COVID and how this last couple of years have been a. Now, digital banking is a perfect place to be in times of a pandemic, but still, you had to kind of corral your organization. Have there been any kind of defining moments during COVID, even, of course, growing faster than ever before? But what did COVID do to you and to Nubank in some way that really is going to be important going into the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I would say the first 2 weeks of COVID, when everybody started, was a moment, one of those adverse moments of adversity where we suddenly saw ourselves in a great adversarial mode, and we had to make a lot of decisions. The first question was, what do we do with our employees? And we are very pro action. We tend to be we rather act too fast and then stop uh, than be too slow our decision making. So we were one of the first companies in Brazil that grabbed their employees and said everybody home. And we didn't know if we had the systems or the infrastructure or how could you even run the bank fully digitally, but we just did it. We had some bumps, but it worked out well, and at least we felt that our employees were safe. Then we had to think about our actual business because we already had a very large credit portfolio and a lot of deposits. And theoretically, in a world of digital banks where you can withdraw money with one button, you can have a run on the bank in a second. People could theoretically click a setting and withdraw 100% of their deposits. And suddenly you're out of liquidity. And that's the death of any bank. In the old world with branches, at least people had to go into a line and wait, and the friction helped the bank to maintain some liquidity. Here, we didn't. So we were really operating on a 24/7 environment the first 2, 3 weeks, looking at every single metric of our business, looking at liquidity, looking at customer behavior, really triple and quadruple testing how resilient we were to face a potential fly of deposits, a potential credit crisis. We had a very big credit portfolio. And ultimately, what we ended up seeing in our balance sheet was the opposite of what we expected. We got a flush of liquidity, which was an amazing sign. That meant customers in the middle of a pandemic decided to trust us more than the big banks. They withdrew money from the big banks and put them into Nubank. That was an amazing sign. And we saw people using that extra liquidity to pay their bills on time. And we saw delinquencies in our credit portfolio go down. So, and then we saw acceleration of the digital banking business because people that were resistant to digital banks, people in their 60s or 70s and 80s, that before the pandemic did not want to do digital banking, they prefer to go to the branch. Well, guess what? Now the branches were closed, and so they were almost forced into adopting digital banking. We were the largest digital bank in Brazil, so we were the biggest benefiter of that inflow of consumers of different segments into our product. So from a business perspective, that accelerated a lot, but it forced us to be really, really closely and look at the business very closely. In the last part, no, most importantly for us was, well, what does this mean in the context of being a consumer obsessed company? Again, go back to the point. Those values have to be driving our actions. And so that meant for us figuring out how we could help our customers. And very quickly, we created a fund of our 20 million reais to help our customers with whatever they needed. There are customers that called us saying, I just lost my job and I don't have money to buy milk for my baby this evening. We would send that person milk. I just lost my job. I don't have food to eat with my family. We would send them iFood with food. We literally just, we told our customer service team, do whatever you need to help your customers.
Why did you do that?
Because of the values. That going back to those values, that our values told us that consumer obsession, and this was a moment where customers needed us the most. So we had to go beyond. We have to figure out how we could help them.
And is that good for business long term? You think it's going to be payoff? You think there's going to be payoff from doing all that?
I believe so. I think it is. Go back to the email story. These customers will remember how we behave with them in times of fear, in times when they lost their jobs, when they were feeling the scariest. They will remember that Nubank sent them milk, and they will not lose us. We gain a customer for the next 4 decades by sending a piece of diaper. So I think it's very consistent doing the right thing for the customer in the short term with winning those customers in the long run.
David, I want to ask you about your purpose now. Tell me about how and most of us, I don't know how you feel, but I feel my purpose has evolved over time. Tell me what is your purpose in life and how does that fit into what you're doing right now?
I'd say my purpose I've been able to crystallize it over the past 10 years. And I've come to realize that to me, what matters is first is impact. That to me is the key word. I want to make sure that every minute, every hour, every day counts, right? That there is an impact, that I've done something, that I moved something. To me, time is something that is going to go away too fast. We're minutes, we're alive for minutes, really. And so impact, being an impactful life, means a lot. And then ultimately, kind of the crystallization that I've been made over the past few years is impact ultimately means for me building a better society, impacting people's lives, living the world a little bit better than the way we found it. I don't know necessarily why I came to that conclusion. I think perhaps it's a lot of what I heard from my family, with my parents, the necessity or the importance of giving back, of building, of being a positive force in society. But to me, that impact today is very much correlated with seeing that I'm working, my day to day work ultimately translates in making more people better, live a better life.
So, on that note, you've joined the Giving Pledge, where you're going to donate most of your wealth to philanthropic causes. What led you to that decision, and what kind of priorities are going to keep guiding you as you think about that? I mean, you've done that very early in your life compared to, say, a Bill Gates or a Warren Buffett or anybody else like that. So, what led you to get to that decision also?
I'll be super frank about the success of Nubank is something that I never imagined could happen. My wife neither. We don't come from wealthy families. We had everything we always needed, but we never lived in an environment of luxury. And frankly, the huge success of Nubank that happened so quickly caught us completely by surprise. And one day, about a year ago, we started realizing that that stock is worth a lot of money, and that created a big conversation. And what do we want to do with this? What was the right way to take advantage of this opportunity, because ultimately it feels like an opportunity. And we went through a bit of a logic, a lot of thinking process, and we concluded that the right thing for us to do was give it all while we're still alive. And I'll give you very briefly a bit of the logic. Number one, it is literally impossible for anybody to spend this kind of money. Some of the I think capitalism is the best system that has ever been invented, and is responsible for an incredible amount of poverty reduction around the world. But the reality is that the system creates extreme outcomes, and these are extreme outcomes that are a bit inefficient to society, because it's actually impossible. Even if you tried, it's actually impossible to spend the amount of money that some of these companies create. So number one, you can't spend all of this money even if you tried. Number two, we will die, who knows, any minute now. We don't know. And we cannot take it with us. There is an end. No matter how much money you have, you will die as everybody else, and you cannot take it with you. So there is an end to the use of that money. Number three, we do not want to leave it to our kids. We don't like the thought process of creating an entire legion of generations that will benefit from this. We will give to our kids everything that they need to live a great life, but we don't think that leaving a bunch of money to them is the right thing for their character, because ultimately, when we look back, we think that adversity made us stronger. At best, adversity built character, and we don't want to take that away from our kids. So we want them to struggle a bit, and we don't want to spoil them with a bunch of money. So number three, we don't want to give it to our kids. And number four, there is a lot of pain in the world. There is a lot of people that don't have to eat, that have been waiting for 6 months to get a surgery in a hospital, that don't know how to put their kids to school. There's a lot of pain, the latent pain today, not 10 years from now, not 40 years from now, today. So you follow that logic, those 4 points. You cannot spend it all. You cannot take it with you. You don't want to give it to the kids. And there is a lot of pain. To me, that equation equals, well, then let's give it all to the people that actually can use it. Let's allocate this capital that society owns on society's behalf on a better way than simply leaving it somewhere yielding some interest rates for the next 40 years. And since the pain happens today, we should start today. What's the point in waiting 4 decades if we can start doing today? And there is a lot of pleasure in that. What we realized is, one thing my mom said a lot when I was growing up is that it's better to give than to receive. And when I was 10 years old, I had no idea what she meant. I love getting my gifts. But as we start doing philanthropy and helping people and working people, and thinking carefully about how to invest that money, because we don't want to just go write checks. We want to teach people to fish, not to just give a fish, right? We want to figure out how to be smart about how to invest that money. There is a lot of actually pleasure and satisfaction in doing that well. And so ultimately, that's a big reason to start doing it now, and doing it you versus leaving it to your kids to do the philanthropy, or waiting 4 decades. Why wait 4 decades if you could still be doing that? You could be doing it now.
Excellent. David, parting words for you. Last question, and we're right near the end. I want to ask you, what advice do you have for future aspiring entrepreneurs? I can tell you there must be many people listening to you saying, I want to do that, and I want to follow in his footsteps. So for those who are inspired by this conversation, what advice do you have for them? Where do they begin? And how should they imagine their life and their purpose and the business they might want to create along the way?
So I would say, first, do homework. Definitely really try to evaluate different opportunities and build conviction, because this is a big investment, right? You're investing not only your money, but you're investing your time. So definitely spend some time and try to find something that really gets you excited, where you can build conviction. The second thing is, though, just be excited about the journey, not the destination. I think it's more about what this next decade of entrepreneurship going to teach you, how you're going to be proven, how you're going to be tested. There's going to be adversity. There's going to be good times. There's going to be bad times. Be attracted by the journey. Don't be attracted about making $1 billion at the end. I ultimately don't think that's what's going to drive you, because perhaps the company doesn't work and you're going to feel horrible. But if you're excited about the journey, then it doesn't really matter what the outcome ends up being. If it works out, great. If it doesn't work out, great. You learn a lot. It was a great experience, and you ultimately came out stronger on the other end. So be attracted to the journey, and that ultimately is kind of the precondition, I think, to just be willing to work really hard. I don't think there is anything really that is meaningful that doesn't require hard work. I would encourage people to look for something that is hard to do. There is a sentence from Walt Disney that says, "I like the impossible because the competition is lower." I talked about this at the beginning. Do hard stuff. Nobody wants to do easy stuff. Like the easy stuff, everybody can do it. Figure out what is really, really hard and do that and focus on that and use everything you got to go after something that is hard. And again, if it doesn't work out, at least you doesn't work out building something hard and than building something easy. So I think those be some advice, some pieces of advice.
David, thank you so very much. It's really been a pleasure. Most insightful conversation for entrepreneurs, for bankers, for transformation thinkers, and even for people who want to be just a better human being. So, David, thank you so much for that, for a most inspiring conversation today. I want to just remind everybody this is a series and there's going to be more to come. So, as we wrap up, you can check it out. So thank you all for being here with us. And David, again, a big thank you and wishing you all the very best and looking forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Professor Gulati. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.